Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's health and wellness webinar, Fruit and Veggie Shopping Habits in the Affordability Era. We are thrilled to have two wonderful speakers today brought to you by the Foundation for Fresh Produce. My name is Katie Calagaro. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications here at the Foundation, and it is my pleasure to host you for today's webinar. At the Foundation, we're growing a healthier world by changing the trajectory of human health, and we believe fruits and vegetables are the answer. We have to remove barriers that prevent people from eating them, and in thinking through those barriers, we are focused on 4 strategic outcomes. We're boosting appeal. What does that mean? We're improving the appeal. We're driving demand for fruits and vegetables through culturally relevant content and education. We need consumers to choose and eat them first, right? We're here to improve access. It's just that, making them accessible can make them easier to eat more. We are nurturing fruit and vegetable professionals, offering professional development and nutrition education resources for professionals like you. We're also scaling partner impact. So we want to form strategic alliances and stakeholder engagements that strengthen our collective global impact. So as a global foundation and thinking globally, but acting locally, this work all culminates here in the US for now under our Have a Plant digital ecosystem. And this helps us all come together with unified messaging to make it easier for the consumer. For those familiar with Have a Plant and fruitsandveggies.org, we are your one-stop shop for all things fruits and vegetables. And we've been hard at work this year, since our last webinar actually, creating a new and improved website experience and newsletter so that it's easier to navigate with an updated top menu bar. And we've elevated the For Professionals page, where we will continue to add new resources for health and wellness professionals like you. For those who aren't familiar, these programs are committed to helping consumers live happier, healthier lives by boosting appeal for fruits and vegetables. We do this through compelling content that inspires consumers. We distribute science-based, consumer-focused resources and food and nutrition and healthy community engagement tools throughout the digital ecosystem, including fruitsandveggies.org that you see here, social media channels, and our newsletters. We also have resources that support health and wellness professionals, specifically through unique fruit and veggie insights and communication tools. This webinar is one, for example. We host them quarterly. We also have consumer behavior and nutrition research reports that you can reference, toolkits with promotional ideas, seasonal recipes, turnkey social media posts, and more. And then as I mentioned, the webinars like you're here today, where we're going to unpack new research related to growing consumption of fruits and vegetables, and then share practical ways that we can implement them in your respective communities. Okay, before we begin, I've got a couple of housekeeping notes. I want to mention that the completion of this webinar awards 1 CPEU in accordance with the Commission on the Dietetic Registration CPEU prior approval program. That is a mouthful, Emily. You will receive your certificate via email after this event. And guess what, guys? Sit back, relax, take it all in. You don't have to write everything down. We are going to be sending you a link and the certificate of attendance afterwards. So you're going to get the recording, you're going to get the PDF of the slides. And if you have questions along the way, I want you to go ahead and use the Q&A function at the bottom. And I will be monitoring those throughout. If we can answer them live at the end, there will be time for Q&A at the end. Our team here, Bailey's here to support too. If we can answer anything in the chat, we will as well. If we don't get to your question today, no fret. Our team will have a record of everybody's questions, and we can follow up with you directly. And if it warrants a broader clarification, we'll make sure we do that in the follow-up email. All right. I am done talking. I'm going to turn it over now to our speakers. And here first is our learning objectives for today, just so you have sort of a baseline to reference. But I don't want to take any more time because we've got Jonna Parker here, a fresh foods market research expert from Circana and a longtime partner of IFPA's Global Insights team. Hi, Jonna, welcome. She's going to break down the complexities of consumer trends and data for us today. And then Emily Holdorf, a registered dietitian and the foundation's influencer and community manager, Emily's going to translate the research into actionable and practical takeaways for you to implement in your field of work. So without further ado, Jonna, take us away. Welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Katie. I just snapshotted that QR code and cannot wait to talk with some of the audiences that I speak with about all those great social media resources. Because as we well know, when folks think about fruits and veggies, as you'll see today, even in the era of affordability, they actually have some amazing response in buying fruits and veggies. So let's jump in. Real quick background, if you're not familiar with Circana, we are a company that strives to bring clarity to what people do. And in the world that we're talking about today, we're going to lean on a couple different data sets that we have. First and foremost, we have detail from 90,000 US retail stores in the grocery food space about where, but then we also track consumers, who's buying, and certainly how much we buy. And this doesn't just track fruits and veggies, it literally tracks everything that we do. Now, before I start thinking Big Brother, remember it's anima, we don't know individuals' names, but we certainly are stewards of patterns and trends from what consumers are doing. We also have deep and rich 40 plus years history of how we're eating and how we're cooking as a society. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then last but not least, we won't get into as much today because fruits and veggies, primarily we're encountering them at the retail space. We also do track where, what, and how much we eat when we go outside of food service. And Circana basically does all of this and exists to have this gigantic data cube, which we can peek in with our little crystal ball and understand certain aspects of the consumer behavior. So that is my goal today. I want to ground you in what actually is happening with what consumers are doing, because the current climate does end up shaping not just what we do with fruits and vegetables, but really how we go about all of our choices with our limited wallet and funds. We're going to really talk about how produce is having a very powerful moment. So we might sit here, and you will sit here and say, gosh, there's still so many pockets of expandable consumption. But the reality is that produce has never been more important to the retailer, to the food service operator. And as I'll show you in a little bit, in some respects, produce is arguably the most important department to help our supermarkets, retailers, and other partners today. And ultimately, at the end, I want to give you some did you know strategies for growth. All of this, we're going to talk about fruits and veggies, but we have to remember we're connected to a much larger world of consumer decision and choice. And I think the role that the foundation does and the vital role that you all play as professionals trying to incent healthier choices, understanding these broader strategies can hopefully lead to ultimately a lot more fruits and veggies being eaten. So to start off, we are in a truly unprecedented market climate. Now, there's a million things I could tell you about having and why it's so unprecedented, but ultimately the most unique element of today's shopping world is that we can buy anything almost from anywhere at any time. This decision making is leading to almost like paralysis of choice. And the way we've always made decisions actually is fragmenting and becoming more complex than ever. We also have to address the elephant in the room. Price has been the headline of the decade. And so I'll talk a little bit about how consumers are viewing the role of price in making choices, specifically in fruits and veggies, but also how it's changing how and where we shop, and honestly, how we cook and stock food in our pantries and refrigerators. And one of my favorite things to talk about that I'm sure many of you will exemplify and join me in being fascinated by is how different our American society is today. And I want to specifically talk about some pockets of the population that we probably don't think about enough, especially in fruits and veggies at retail and supply. We often say things like, well, this is what consumers want. But the reality is we are 300 million markets of one. In so many other industries, really do take into account that not everybody is all doing the same thing all of the time. Could you guys imagine if wine only had a couple choices, the way we have only a couple choices of lettuce? It is an opportunity to more deeply understand these different populations, and we have a couple areas that we think are worth leaning into to grow fruit and veggie consumption. So first and foremost, tariffs. Consumers expect price increases to come because of the current economic climate. And while tariffs are the headline, there's a copious amount of other reasons that I'm sure you all know even better than I that are changing the traditional way you grow and price fruits, vegetables, and truly all food. But we're here to talk today about what the consumer thinks. And when it comes to the consumer, even those who support tariffs have increased their belief on the role of tariffs on price. Now, in the fruit and veggie space, we have a mix of grown in America as well as have to import just based on market climate. I know we would love to grow bananas domestically, but we just don't have the climate for it. So we definitely represent a space that is going to see a mixed bag of a renewed sense of looking for options that are grown here because there's a belief or an actuality of them not being able to have to take tariff pricing. And there's also, of course, things that we love to eat and cook with that we just can't grow here 52 weeks a year. But what this all means for consumers is there is a cloud of concern about affordability. And remember, on top of today's current market climate is 5 years of inflation. And if you've visited or talked with me previously or looked at anything that Circana has published, you know that inflation across the store is real, and things like eggs, of course, but also shortening fats and oils like butter and margarine and cooking oil, as well as things like salty snacks and carbonated beverages, truly have had double-digit price increases since 2022. Veggies actually have not, and we'll talk about that today. But this overall perception is that consumers are already feeling the sting at the shelf, and they'll continue to have this aura and feeling of price concern. The other big thing we have to talk about is consumer confidence. So, one of the good things we're reporting in June, we observed a bit of an uptick from really the bottoming out of consumer confidence, where more than 50% of Americans in April and May of this year were not confident about their future finances. We've seen a bit of a rebound. And in June, we did see a little bit of an uptick in terms of confidence. But as you see on this graph, it's still sitting well below consumers' expectation of future economy and their own future affordability from where we were in 2024. Now, that expectation is not necessarily seeing reality because both the CPI as well as the categories we track at Circana are only seeing moderate and arguably historically lower inflation rates. So there's a belief that hasn't yet manifested. I think we're in a honeymoon period for that. The reality is as we hit fall, not only just because of the global economic trade happening, but also just because people have been keeping inflation at bay in decision-making buying desks because we're not quite sure what the future holds. So there will be a period where our expectation of inflation will likely meet reality. Now, the other thing that we're in a honeymoon period on is employment. We are in a very stable labor market, but we're in an evolving labor market. So I always represent these numbers in the reality that the jobs that existed a decade or certainly 20 years ago are unlikely to look exactly the same 10, 20 years from now. So we're really in this strange bow tie moment where we're transitioning into different types of jobs and employment opportunities while we're still chained to the way we've always hired and promoted and staffed and trained people. Specifically, I want to talk about that for the grocery and food service industry because it has been a pivot from labor intensive people jobs into more technology enabled jobs. And that, of course, is we're right in the middle of that moment. So all of this has led us to something that actually has stayed quite stable, and that is food and beverage dollars. So through 2024, American consumers spent 1.7 trillion with a T to do the whole like Dr. Evil thing, trillion dollars, nearly $2 trillion on food and beverage. And the split between retail spending and food service or out of home spending has actually stayed at 61-39 since 2021. Now, both are growing. So as you see there, dollars generated year over year at retail, which by the way would include everywhere, not just grocery stores. That's anywhere that's selling food and beverage in a retail establishment. Convenience stores, dollar stores, online. If it is a retail food and beverage establishment, we're capturing it. And then food service would include, like this picture, both when someone does takeout from a fully, a restaurant of any type, but also, of course, dine in. So keep that in mind. This does include the newer ways to solve food, like online shopping or online delivery or pickup. Ultimately, the big thing though is food service traffic remains constrained, especially in this era of affordability. It's tough in the consumer's mind to suddenly justify outsourcing the entire meal when they could, in theory, and they have gained 5 years of new cooking skills thanks to COVID. So we are seeing less traffic through food service, even though dollars are staying buoyant. It's why you're seeing this summer a lot of QSRs, especially, do a lot of snackable type offerings. McDonald's Snack Wrap got big buzz last week because they want to interrupt that traffic. Maybe they're not getting lunch and dinner, but can they get that little quick meal? Now, remember all of this though is dollars. When we look at number of eating occasions, retail still remains heavily where the pendulum is shifted. Almost 9 out of 10 occasions, or 86%, someone is eating food they source from retail. And it's only a sliver of occasions that people are using food service to solve that food need. All of this has created a new shopping pattern. So, the biggest headline I've been talking about in my work this year is that we are in a just in time shopping era. On the left hand side in white, you see the pink line. That represents the number of unique product categories across food and beverage that someone's buying on each shopping trip. So, as you see here, it has eroded. And really, there is a much more emphasis on people buying just what they need when they need it. And because we're buying just what we need at the store that it's most relevant, and that we just want to get those few things that we need because we don't want to spend too much and we don't want to waste, we're of course seeing an increase, an exponential increase to the tune of 30 more trips a year. So these more trips are actually hugely benefiting the fresh foods industry, and we've hit an all-time high in the number of times throughout a year that someone buys fresh foods from a retail establishment. Produce actually has gained the most by far of any food and beverage department. Produce is now the most frequently bought fresh department and is only second behind the entirety of general food. Think about a grocery store in that big middle and all those aisles. That's the only faster moving, more frequently visited department in the entire store. So even with all the change we've seen in dairy and in the meat department, produce is still demanding frequency. In fact, 12 produce categories in both fruits and veggies are bought more often than the entirety of anything in seafood. That is how much frequency is the superpower of fruit and veggie in the retail landscape. Now, we've specifically seen a lot of fruits gain a tremendous amount more trips per each year. So we'll talk in a minute about some of the tremendous growth that we've seen in certain fruits, but that is directly attributed to people buying them much more often. So avocados and berries and truly mandarins have actually been growing in trip frequency over the last 10 years. People now use them in multiple ways throughout the day, throughout the meal, and therefore they've created not necessarily new buyers, but actually new demand that's driving more frequent baskets and trips for those three items. Tree fruit, grapes, and mangoes is a newer phenomenon. That's something we've only seen in the last 2 years, and it's been both a mix of new entrants, like in tree fruit. We actually had our pre-chat about all the new varieties of tree fruit and what an amazing season it's been for tree fruit. Tree fruit, of course, is cherries, plums, nectarines, peaches, and all the hybrids that are hitting market. But grapes and mangoes, while they've had a better growing season this past year, arguably, that's directly attributed to consumers changing taste palettes. Mangoes are really meeting a demand that we first saw in dried fruit, that now fresh fruit is now becoming a weekly, if not monthly purchase for many more consumers. In grapes, I think as we've talked about before, social media has fundamentally changed the role of basic grapes in an American's diet, and we directly see that coming from the Gen Z generation. So shopping more often does have a yin to the yang. We are keeping less food on hand. And again, What we're seeing is an erosion across all food and beverage in the pantry and in the fridge. But I think why produce is having this moment is best exemplified by this meme. What has held fruits and veggies back in the American mindset for many, many years? Well, that ideal. I want to be somebody who's plant forward. I want to be somebody who eats all this amazing produce. I wish I was the person I thought I was before I bought all this produce. But now that we're shopping just what we need when we need it, or we're ordering just what we need when we need it, produce is far more relevant than ever before. So, this pivot to having just what's on hand and this European style of fresh shopping actually should be a bigger moment for us in produce than it is. So let's talk about where we're shopping because that has also fundamentally changed. One of the biggest things we look at in Circana in our retail is by channel. So this chart looks specifically at fresh produce as a department, so both fruits and veggies combined. And the first row is the row you're most familiar with. Food traditional is a synonym for the average everyday supermarket. They're a conventional supermarket, not that they don't carry organics or natural products. They're also carrying budget and value products. They are your average American supermarket, whether they be in a small town like an IGA or they be a mega chain like a Kroger or an Albertsons. That represents in year to date 2025, 46.4% of total produce sales. But actually, the growth rates at traditional supermarkets are not keeping pace. So only 70% of all additional produce dollars year to date have been contributed by that channel, hence the 7%. Now, we're fun math people, so we calculated a fair share. Fair share means if you're doing this much in total sales, we would expect you, i.e., an index of 100, to also contribute that much to growth. But as you see, because traditional food supermarkets are not growing as fast as other channels in produce, they have a fair share of an abysmal 16. Now let's talk about food natural stores. That would be your health and natural channel. So we're talking about Sprouts, Whole Foods, we're talking about the fresh market, and any kind of grocery store that says we're not all things to all people, we exist to be a health food store. When it comes to fruits and vegetables and produce, you're about 3.7% of total sales in that channel, far less than average supermarket. But they're growing, contributing 9% to growth. 9% of all growth is coming from that one tiny channel alone, which is a double fair share of expectation. Food value in fresh produce is actually a really interesting anomaly. So discount grocers are truly having a great moment in terms of overall store openings, and in other departments are commanding a lot of growth. Food value is still 11 or 10% right now. So that's discount grocers. Discount grocers are 10% of all produce, so a much bigger contribution to total, but produce growth is actually underpacing. The second, though, and by the way, I've separated food value into certain chains. Some chains are investing in having truly interesting and unique produce and even organics. And those food value chains are actually outperforming growth exponentially. So it's not to say that discount grocers can't be relevant in produce. If they step up their game, it's going to be gangbusters. And that's the story of mass and club. Now, mass includes both Walmart and Target, and it is a tale of two cities. So, but it's a now 19% of all produce sold in this country comes from either Walmart or Target. Walmart's bigger. And they are punching at, or in Walmart's case, above their weight. Look at club stores. 14% of all produce sales in this country comes from BJ, Sam's, and Costco collectively. And it's almost a 3x growth contributor. Club is so much not just about buying in bulk, it is about unique varieties and quality expectations. And what they're doing there is truly creating exclusivity and loyalty. And last but not least, internet, online shopping. Online shopping is only 4% of fresh fruits and veggies, but look at that growth rate. And that's actually our hot topic at Circana for the new year. People are buying fresh fruits and vegetables online, and it is an absolute untapped growth accelerator. So let's talk about what next. And when I talk about these what next bullets, I want to first take a minute to talk about sustainability. So we at Circana actually have studied sustainability and its role that consumers have on their purchasing for many years. And what we found is across the store, sustainably marketed products are growing faster than the total market. And as you see here, actually much faster than traditionally marketed product. Now, I'm not talking just about organics here. I'm talking about things like when Earthbound Farms have now moved to a biodegradable plant-based tub. That would be a sustainably marketed product. Or let's say a product that's really pushing how it is doing its growing methods in an eco-friendly way, or its packaging in an eco-friendly way. That continues to be a growth accelerator, and truly one that I think produce hasn't even yet realized how to tap into. We're also seeing sustainably marketed products delivering a ton more growth since 2013. So overarchingly, not only has there been a rise of recyclable packaging and sustainably grown or produced products, but we continue to see that not just hit the zeitgeist and then get discontinued, it's actually creating a fundamentally different share contributor overall. And again, this is total products across the store, not just produce. Because I would argue, one would say, oh, produce, we do a lot of bulk and so it's sustainable. No, getting more vocal and telling our stories will have appeal, because if not, we're going to be outmarketed by other products in other aisles that are recognizing the need for sustainability. So one other big mega trend, as we're still in the consumer section of our discussion, is about wellness. Now, we do an annual global wellness study, and this is what comes from it. And we'll be updating it in the back half of this year. And when we talk about wellness, we're talking about every wellness goal a consumer may have. So for example, this year, in addition to losing weight and staying healthy and living longer, 3 specific goals have increased their receptivity in terms of what we see consumers do more often. They're looking to feel better, so that mental wellness overall feeling. They're looking to have more energy. Energy, because of our increased role in physical wellness, and also having these things track our steps, more energy and energy fuel has become a huge part of total food and beverage marketing. And then there's also this looking better, right? This belief that I want to feel better inside and out. That also gets into the fact that we've seen products not just tap into physical wellness attributes, but also mental wellness and bringing a sense of community. I think we've just hit the tip of the iceberg of talking about how the produce industry takes care of its workers and the communities that it serves. But we have those stories in spades. I do also want to address GLP-1s. I don't want to drain it because I know there was an earlier webinar by the foundation that went much deeper. But as you probably know, people who are on GLP-1s have different diet needs. When we study GLP-1s at Circana, it's by creating a group of consumers who are on GLP-1s. We can also look in our research at people who were on but do not intend to go back, people who are maybe lax, and also people who would never go on a GLP-1. But we found when people are actively using GLP-1s, there's a variety of things they're looking for. But the 2 benefits that we don't talk enough about are fiber and protein. Those 2 elements are not just demanded by GLP-1 users, but we've found them to be the 2 most in-demand requirements for a wide variety of consumers. Produce is not talking enough about the fiber and protein and also healthy fat and other of these benefits. And so in a lot of cases, especially to GLP-1 users, we're being outmarketed. Now, all of this out marketing, which is something I really want to use as a framework to talk as we go forward, is really because there is a segment of consumers who all of these wellness trends, and arguably some of the sustainability trends as well, really are aimed at what we call the healthy chic. This is a consumer segment that we've established, again, across all buying behavior, who is fundamentally committed to feeling good through diet and exercise. They are your top box score, very healthy eater, and they are always early adopters and actively trying to improve their eating. The work the foundation does should be that as your top group. Now, a little bit about the healthy chic consumer segment. They are not the most affluent group, but they are definitely upwards in their affluence, and they have children present. So 52% of the healthy chic, which think of them as someone who's in their 30s and 40s today, and they have children at home. By the way, we actually have many segments, but we wanted to talk about this today. This is not just everyone who has a family. This is someone who both them and their children are really trying to eat healthy. But what we found actually, when we just pulled data through June of this year, is that produce, despite all of its gains I'll show in a minute, is not necessarily gaining sales, especially in vegetables, with this most health conscious consumer group. So, for example, we have great household penetration in both fruit and veg, with nearly all of people in this consumer group buying fruits and vegetables, but it's flat. We also have seen an increase in fruit spending per buyer, but arguably, actually, this group isn't spending that much more on fresh fruit than the average consumer. And the spending per trip is high, but the growth rate are actually not keeping pace with inflation. Now, on the veg side, as you can already see, we're actually seeing a decrease in amount spent per trip that is also deeper than the average price. We have work to do with this group, and why I took a picture of that screenshot of social and digital is this group should be the group we're killing it with. So let's talk about how produce is faring in general. But I did want to point out that whenever we think about produce marketing or incenting people to do more with produce, we really have to remember there's that we really should be doing well with the audience and then everyone else. So I'm going to talk a little about produce in general, especially with its role at retail next. So first of all, this fun eye chart is a graphic we're doing on a monthly basis, especially for tracking and positioning produce, which is highlighted there as a department, against all of the other. First off, the first row is total edible. That's total food and beverage sales across everything food and beverage. And then of course we break down our departments that are typically seen in the average store beneath it. So in the 52 weeks ending June, we're seeing the sales of produce grow at about 3%, and the volume, in this case pounds, in produce grow also at about 3%. But I always invite you to benchmark those rates for produce against other food and beverage departments in the store. And what you see when you benchmark, you see that produce is incredibly cheap in price per volume or unit. It's an average when someone buys something from the produce department of only about $1.50 versus $4.30 average and acceleratingly higher averages in any other department. Produce, fruits and veggies are a very strong value, especially compared to other fruits, beverage, I should say foods across the store. Now keep in mind that beverage number is per ounce. The average per unit in the beverages category, which has seen phenomenal growth as you see, is actually more about $3 or $4. So, but here's the piece. Other groups, especially in refrigerated dairy, have been growing their price. We know what's going on in meat and dairy. It's a disruption of the supply, resulting in a pass along of price. Produce prices have held stable, and they're a tremendous value. And yet our sales are middling at best. Now, another piece we love to look at, those are sales and price metrics. We love to look at shopper engagement metrics. So the metrics we're looking at here in purple are percent of households buying. Across all households, not just the health engaged consumer, across all households, produce and truly none of the departments have a problem with household penetration. People buy these departments over time. Dollars per buyer is all kind of a ladder underneath total food and beverage. Produce spend per the average American household went up about 3% last year. But the average spend for total food and beverage, that top row, went up 4.4%. So if we were again doing a fair share calculation, you would see that produce has not increased its fair share of the overall food and beverage dollar acceleration pie. What has, of course, we knew dairy, not just eggs, but we're also seeing increased spend in yogurt by people buying multiple types of yogurt for different needs. We're also seeing increase in the beverages department as we've seen new entrants from both the soda as well as the water elements of those categories. So those are departments that are keeping pace with the growth of overall food and beverage. Now, product trips per buyer, again, is where we shine. So certainly the general food aisle has the most trips, but produce outperforms other departments in terms of the number of times someone visits a year, and we're acceleratingly increasing that. But the number of products or unit sales per trip in yellow is decreasing. With 65 veggies that we track and over 40 fruits, 100 different item options in the average produce department, and we're at most getting 3 items in and decreasing in average, we have a lot to do to not just get people in the department, but deepen their baskets. Regionality is something we always take a look at. But it's really population shifts that are driving produce regionality. No longer are people concentrated on the coasts as folks migrate down south from the Northeast and the Midwest, and as they gravitate from California or the East into the West, which by the way is where I live in Arizona, we're seeing these population shifts actually then show an increased produce development. When people are moving to other parts, especially younger families and younger people, they want and expect more from the grocery stores they're meeting there because they're bringing other things they've seen maybe in the Northeast or California. Now let's go deeper and talk about specific food categories. This is a ranking that we do every month for year to date 2025 of absolute dollar sales growth. So when pink isn't the total sales, that's the amount of additional sales year to date versus that same period a year ago. So how to read this would be beef has added $4.5 billion with a B just since the first 6 months of this year. And actually, if you think that's just inflation, we've seen a volume or pound increase in beef of 6.2%. That's on top of all-time highs already. So if you're wondering what are people buying more of in fresh, this is your list. Now, berries has been the number 3 position on this list for the 8 years I have done this list. Berries continues to add dollars and pound volume. In fact, berries have become ubiquitous. Avocados are making this list at a really interesting time. So we know that avocados are in the crosshairs for tariffs, but we've also seen that they've increased their demand. Avocados are a poster child, as are grapes and mangoes, for almost any other fruit or vegetable. When you increase how someone uses it, it increases their want for it and their trip frequency, and then they in turn reward you with dollars and loyalty. Avocados, even despite some price pressure, are increasing pounds sold at 2.6% year to date. Now, note how several other items on this list that are not members of the produce department say things like ready to eat. They say things like deli entree or prepared meat or salad. All of those categories represent turnkey options at retail that someone's using for a meal. I also want to point out that specialty cheese continues to be a juggernaut because it's tapping into the snackability and an elevated snacking or grazing experience. Yes, it is true, we are still making charcuterie boards, and increasingly, those aren't just for special occasions, that's for lunch at your desk. Those are trends we could easily tap into in the produce department. Now, I won't drain these slides because there's a lot of detail here. They'll be in the packet in the recording. But if we want to take a look at the fresh fruit aisle of the produce department, really the share or contribution of various fruits and fruits are relatively similar. The volume share also is very similar to the dollar share, with the biggest exception being fresh berries commands a lot of dollars, but a low share of pounds, and bananas is the reverse. But what is happening today in fruit, and you're going to see the same thing in veg in a minute, is when one category grows, another category declines. What I always invite us to really be working towards is a rising tide that floats all boats. So right now, what we see in our switching data is the growth of grapes and mandarins and berries has come at the expense of bananas and melons and apples because these are seen as newer and exciting fruits with better taste experiences and multiple uses. And instead of cutting out a salty snack or a fruit or power bar in another aisle, we're actually just switching people from one part of produce to the other. The goal is fruit and vegetable consumption, not just switching. And the same is true with veggie. When one goes up, the other goes down. But the other thing that's happening with vegetables, especially in a category like potatoes, what is that? Potatoes is we're seeing a lot of price. So for example, potato growers historically were really anchored on people buying 10, 8, 5-pound bags of potatoes, putting them in a pantry, and then cooking from them throughout the week. Well, that's not how we cook today. So a lot more potatoes are actually being sold by smaller, more frequent packages, but then those are less in each dollars. But we should welcome that because ultimately, if we want to grow fresh fruit and especially fresh vegetable consumption, we have to meet the consumer where they are, and that is not stack them high and watch them fly. And I should say, we track 64 vegetables under here, and IFPA members can actually access category-specific insights. Let's talk about organic and value add and then wrap up with some ideas for growth. So first off, despite all the economic and affordability pieces, organic produce continues to grow. So organic produce growth in share is at an all-time high. Well, actually meeting the high we saw in 2021. Remember, in 2021, consumers were very much homebound still, but we're at 12.5% of total produce dollars for organics, and we're at an astounding 8.4% of pounds. Despite affordability, organic, especially among the healthy chic and the sustainability minded, is in demand, and the choice is less about organic to conventional, but actually about organic versus something else organic. When it comes to organic produce, the top growth pounds actually come from bananas. Bananas are struggling nationally, but with organic consumers, they are growing. Mangoes, grapes, and berries are also growing, but again, part of the overall rising tide, just people who are organically inclined choosing the organic. And broccoli is also growing. So organic is about meeting a specific consumer's needs and meeting them where they are. It's not about trying to get everyone who buys conventional to pay $1 more. It's about creating a new tier that's sustainable and health minded for organic demand. Now, value add, which is what we consider when you take a commodity and you cut, core, kind, peel it, you basically sell it with one step fixed for the consumer, is actually seeing a steady increase in share. Now, this I do attribute to affordability and the fact that a lot of what we're offering in value added produce is kind of too simple with too much of a price cliff. What we are seeing resonate in value added produce are snackable and portion sized options. When the added value makes it easier or makes it easier to cook as well, so you've got a portion size, you've also got an air fry ready type concept, those value adds are still doing well. But given the fact that the average fruit bowl is a very expensive endeavor for the average consumer versus just picking up a piece of fruit, not to say it doesn't work, but again, it limits the amount of the demand. Now, from a value add perspective, there are some elements of value add that are seeing phenomenal growth. It's still intimidating for an average consumer to know how to cut a mango, so we're seeing growth, especially in fresh cut mango. Again, potatoes have actually made it into more carts and replaced non-fresh produce or non-fresh veg options by becoming easier to cook and prepare. Pineapple is also very intimidating, and so we continue to see growth of value add. Garlic is one of my favorites. Garlic, because we're cooking at home more and so many of the new recipes require increased garlic, having pre-cut fresh garlic actually, while still in very small distribution, is doing really, really well, because just like a pineapple, peeling, cutting, and getting your hands all dirty does intimidate many consumers. So, with my remaining time with you all today, I want to give you some ideas for growth. And I always think of that as we are all driving on the exact same road, just like at the Indy 500. That circle really hasn't changed. It gets repaved every year, but it's the same duration and pitch and length. What has changed is the car with which race car drivers take to it. And that's the same case for us in fresh produce and really in our roles. We can be driving so much faster and so much easier if we embrace technology and think differently, even if we're on the same road. So, my first idea for growth is to think about generations. We are in an unprecedented era of 5 diverse generations making up our buying populace. And the reality, I'm sorry as an Xer, is that we grew up in a fundamentally different world than millennials and Gen Z. And we're not going back. While there is a bit of a romance right now with Gen Z's unplugging, the reality is they expect a world that is as connected, as diverse, and as available as they've experienced their entire lives. Food available anywhere, anytime is their true competitive set. They are not going to walk up and down an aisle and clip coupons at a circular ad. I'm sorry. They are digital and social engaged, and it's time we recognize this. Now, when we look at the generations, we also have to remember, I'm going to click quick through this. A lot of times, especially in produce decision-making desks, we're thinking about Gen Z as these kids in school. But the reality is that they are now in their late 20s. They're going to college, they're buying their first homes, and actually a lot of Gen Zs are getting married and having their first kid. We're also seeing that the Gen X buying populace is moving toward retirement. As those household sizes shrink, it's going to directly affect us in produce, because here's why, and I'll just put the whole slide up versus doing the click. Gen Z currently represents only 2% of total produce dollars, whereas boomers collectively make up 20%. But the boomers are in the last part of their lifestyle. They're not changing habits or growing their households. Gen Z is. Young millennials, older millennials make up another very small percentage of today's produce dollars. Because admittedly, if someone tells you, well, in produce, we're marketing to people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, you're right. That's the lion's share of dollars today. But we have to recognize that it won't be the lion's share of dollars 10 years from now. And we have to meet these younger consumers where they are. And when we think about where younger consumers are in produce today, what we're seeing again is when it comes terms of SKU. So what we did here was take a look at spending and we indexed each generation relative to Gen Pop. And we pointed out some product categories in fruit and veg that are more predominantly bought by that generation. We had to dig to find things that are young millennial and Gen Z inclined. The reality is that we market fruits and vegetables, but we are Gen X and boomers. Okay, I'm on the cusp, but I'm just saying a lot of the decisions in produce are made by Gen X and boomers trying to enforce on millennials and Gen Z. But take a look at where younger gens are increasing their spending. Maybe they don't skew the whole category today. They're definitely increasing their spend on berries, avocados, and kiwis. And I argue they could increase their spend on any fruit or vegetable. But we have to stop thinking they're just going to wake up one day and start acting like us. They are a new generation with new tastes who want different experiences, and we have to meet them where they are. So the other strategy for growth is around price. And I'm going to go through this really fast because we're short on time. The deck is available. But as I mentioned earlier, there are other food categories that are experiencing extreme inflation since 2021. So if you stack each of those purple bars on top of each other, you would end up in that purple line at the price increase that we have experienced in food and beverage at retail since the dawn of the decade. Every quarter has increased price. And food and beverage since 2020 is up 30%. With some categories we buy all the time, like cookies, eggs, shortening, and oil, up 50 to 60, in the case of eggs, 153%. Now, in this climate of everything going up, produce has only raised our average price by 19%. And one would argue because of the growth in organics and several higher priced fruits at the expense of cheaper fruits, it's not inflation. It's actually just the change in how we're buying. We're not experiencing produce inflation. That's not our problem. But we are part of the categories where people, number one, expect to feel the impact of tariffs. But the reality is right now, produce's average retail price year to date is actually, one would argue, maybe even deflating. And a lot of that is because retailers are creating deep discounts that aren't necessarily moving market share, and they're certainly not increasing consumption, except in some of those fruit pockets I mentioned. Whoop, sorry. This is a really important chart. We took a look at fresh fruits and vegetables value per purchase. So their average price someone pays when they do a choice in purple and fresh vegetables and a choice from fresh fruits. These are actual data-based numbers. Now imagine they're choosing other aisles, other options outside of produce. Nutrition bars, someone is spending at retail $7 when they buy a box of nutrition bars. When they buy a prepared side dish versus a fresh vegetable, they're spending almost $4 to $5. And things like cottage cheese and frozen prepared veg are also expensive per package. Produce, fresh fruits and veggies are a tremendous value for the same serving size and the same use occasion. And we have to get back to the heart of that. Instead of saying, what was my price on Honeycrisp last year? Let me match it because it'll just raise Honeycrisp and bring all these people to it. That's not true. What will increase fresh fruit and vegetable consumption and purchases is if the quality meets expectations for the store, if we make it convenient to shop for, if we create an experience, and I love that picture, the work all of you do, especially as registered dietitians or the nutrition folks at a retailer or a supplier, we got to make the experience easy. If you suddenly get subscribed to GLP-1 and you're walking into that store or you're starting to do your online shop and you have no idea where to go, if you search a term like fiber, you're going to get a bunch of nutrition bars and center store foods. Why aren't we doing that with fruit and veg? And ultimately, we are so relevant, especially with the healthiest consumer group. as well as a generation who has been raised to think about the food pyramid and having healthier choices at their schools and colleges. Why are we not meeting this moment and competing on more than price? So, one last piece to leave you with, and that is this. We sell categories. Maybe you don't at your part of the industry, but the folks you're influencing at decision making desks at suppliers, retailers, and brands, but shoppers solve needs. We have to think about the fact that when an item that is ubiquitously purchased, like eggs, is purchased, it takes up more of that spend. That's what we saw earlier this year. Consumer spending is not infinitely expandable. So when the price of eggs in January and February went up 80% over an all-time high the year before and the year before, and a 5-year increase of 150%, we actually saw 4% more units of eggs sold. Because guess what? Eggs are bought and used and ubiquitous and relevant. So people are willing to pay a little bit more to keep doing all the things they were doing with eggs. Berries is actually a companion. It's a breakfast solution. It pairs great with other breakfast solutions. And even though the berries got kicked out a little bit, berries had a great relevant moment because they were common and not as top of mind. We didn't need to discount those berries, or if we did, we could have sold even more. But what does kick even farther out of orbit in the gravitational pull are things that become discretionary. And I fear that is where a lot of our vegetables are seating today. If the cost of everything is going up, things that are companions to the things you have to buy, that makes sense to keep doing. But the things that are difficult, or you have to think too much about to try to make it onto your plate or in your pantry, that is not going to make it into the basket. So we really have to think about pricing and recommending things in cohorts to each other, and even be monitoring things that are happening in other aisles, because it will disrupt how people solve the meal. So with that, I would like to, let me just try to get ahead here. I'd like to turn it over to Emily to close out with practical applications from the foundation. Thank you so much, Emily. Do we have Emily on the line? Oop, sorry. I got to give you back control, I think. Okay. All right. Sorry, Emily. I'm just going to stop touching things.
Sorry, thanks for bearing with us there. I had to get my mouse back to unmute myself. So I'm gonna go back a little bit here, but thank you so much, Jonna. Totally love every time I get to hear you speak on different trends in the research and what's going on. It's just always so impactful. So thank you. So let's close us out here. I'm going to cover some practical tips. I'm not going to go through every single one, but I'm going to kind of voice over just the general theme of kind of what I want to highlight on the next 3 slides, and then we'll jump into some Q&A. So with this reframing the value story piece, you know, we all have heard the age-old tale of fruits and veggies are too expensive. As Jonna, you know, laid out for us, produce is not as impacted by the inflationary times that we are in. So something that came up when we were kind of discussing this topic in general was reframing the value story to more so of what we like to think about in maybe fashion, or when you're buying shoes or purses or things like that, is that cost per use really matters. Like that's what's really driving purchases for people, especially with the just-in-time shopping and things like Jonna covered earlier. So if we can lay out that, you know, here's this $3 head of cauliflower, but here are 3 different ways that you could use it. You could roast it, you could rice it up, you could add it to a soup. It's the real value is in that versatility. So showing and showcasing that the more meals you can incorporate something in, the better the investment. It's going to make people feel smart and successful with their purchases. And so just like I said, slightly reframing the narrative, and it might just create a different perspective for people, create some unlocks for people when they are going to choose produce items. So as you can see here on the screen, a few different use cases for how you could reframe this too expensive to smart investment kind of thought process with people that you're working with. Next, we'll jump over to using what's trending to boost the whole basket. So as Jonna had shared, berries, grapes, avocados, mangoes, those are all currently pulling major share in the produce department. And while that's great news, it can also mean other items are getting overlooked. So thinking about how to use trending items, trending fruits and veggies, I should say, as entry points to lift up that entire category of produce is really key. And so if you've been with us for a while, you know at fruitsandveggies.org, we love our powerful produce pairings. And typically we are highlighting something where we're pairing a piece of produce with a different part of the plate. This is once again, just a slight shift on that thinking of how can we still do that, pair produce with other parts of the plate, but also add another produce item into the mix. So this example here on the left-hand side of pairing it with signage. So are you grabbing grapes? Grab some carrots too, and maybe roast it in a different way than you normally would with that sweet and savory mix. So just getting a little creative with what those pairings actually look like and trying to add another produce item into the mix rather than just focusing on, okay, here's a produce item with dairy or with a lean protein or things like that. So lastly, we'll touch on the modern household where Jonna was kind of closing out and just rethinking about the different consumers in general and what those personas are looking like. I think so often we're still locked in, like Jonna had said, like Gen Z are still school age or millennials are kind of in single households. These are the people that are really building their families, and not only are they building families, but they're building habits with those families. So kind of just reframing and rethinking. We know that the Gen X and boomers are shifting from a history of feeding other people to now just feeding themselves again. And so this is a powerful time to help that group of people reconnect with food in ways that is not only joyful, but it leans into taking care of themselves, making themselves feel good. So once again, it's just a slight flip in how to think about the various generations and households and who that persona is, and being able to stay relevant to all of those types of households. So as we mentioned earlier, you will get these slides and you can kind of take some of these ideas and run with them. They're broken out into the 4 different points of influence. So you'll see some types of retail tips, food service and culinary tips, as well as different social media tips and in that more clinical space as well. So let's, in our last 2 minutes, I think we have, jump into some questions. I'm gonna pull down my.
I actually just pulled up the questions. I think there's 2 we can answer really quick, Emily, if you're game for
Perfect.
it. And there's a third that I know Bailey, who is my excellent senior industry analyst, is answering. And we also answered a few others live in the system. So the
Great.
first one, and I think is interesting, is the first one is about what about farmers markets? So it's interesting. I want to cover that quickly. We would include farmers markets in our specialty designation. If you're looking at that slide I shared earlier, the reality is that farmers markets sales incidence rate of people reporting they're going to a farmers market is increasing, but it's still less than 1% of total. I mean, I think it's even less than 0.5% of total fruit and veg. It's very much a specialty experience, but it is not necessarily when someone visits a farmer's market. Again, if you live in Salinas, California, different. But for the average American, anywhere in America, a farmer's market is less than 1% of your total spend in fruits and vegetables. So the concept is still having a lot of buoyancy, even in this economy, but arguably, I think we think about it in the industry more than it actually impacts us. I argue Aldi opening a store or remodeling a store will impact its competition far more. And Walmart going online has changed everything way more than farmers markets ever did. But that's a good question. And then kind of the last question, Emily, I'd love kind of your talk on this, especially what you see different with younger consumers. in the nutritional space. But how do we know which generation is purchasing what items? Let me cover that methodology really quick, and then Emily, I'd love your thoughts on younger generation differences you're seeing at the foundation. The methodology that we use is all of our data ties back at Circana. We have the ability to understand who's living in the household and then look at their behavior. So when I talk about that slide that talked about Gen Z over indexing, it was taking households that are headed up by Gen Zs. So the Gen Z is the primary shopper, and how they spend on different fruits and vegetables indexed to the average consumer. So that is how we calculated that slide. And then the growth I noted at the bottom for berries, kiwis, and grapes was looking at those Gen Z led households year over year spend. So that's kind of our methodology. But Emily, any parting thoughts on generational differences you're seeing at the foundation?
Yeah, I think something to touch on is that while yes, Gen Z and millennials are kind of in their, more adulting era and starting to build their own families and things like that, they still really are gaining or getting their information from social media. That's such a huge piece of it. And so with Jonna mentioning like grapes really over indexing and having a lot of volume share, that is seriously due to social media. Like grapes have taken over in so many different ways. And not only is it something that's trendy, but grapes also are a nice, when you cut them safely and appropriately, are a nice kid-friendly snack too. So it's kind of double, you're like crossing over in both of those areas of here's a trend that's fun, but here's something that's also going to work for my family. So I think that's also something to consider too.
Yeah, and just one, I know we're over, but one last point for the recording mainly. There was also a question in the chat about the role social and digital have put in what people buy. And I want to say I've studied this within an inch of its life. Our firm literally has a study that you can run that attributes social listening and ties it back to sales results when things in social zeitgeist spike. And there's two things about social. If something does pick up views, it does translate into purchases. Even watermelon and mustard saw a little bit of a lift when that was going viral. But I always bring up cloud bread. People were obsessed with cloud bread. They were making it, they made it once, and then they moved on. And then there was the cucumber or the grape, or we still see evidence of people who are buying feta and cherry tomatoes and olive oil together because it was a hack, as the kids say, as my kids say, right? When you solved the problem first of an easy bakeable dinner, then those ingredients get bought more often, and people are getting super creative about what else they can mix in there. When it was like, hey, isn't this cool? Doesn't it taste fun? Let's do it as a dare. That's having a one time. I think more veggies going viral. I want a t-shirt. I think that'd be great.
Right. No, that's so true. I think the trends of social media and the influence that social media has is seriously real. So I just want to say thank you all again. I'm just gonna quickly flash up here my slides again to close this out. But thank you all for joining us. As you know, if you haven't already, save fruitsandveggies.org in your favorites. Visit us, get all of your tips and tricks. We're here to help you, and that is, oh, okay. Well, we're having some technical difficulties, but thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.